August 1945, Western Pacific. The sun bled gold across the carrier deck of the USS Langley as the ocean breathed below, slow, rhythmic, endless. Metal shimmered under the morning haze, and a small, compact fighter crouched at the edge of the catapult. The deck crew moved like choreographed ghosts, orange jerseys catching the light, their shouts swallowed by the wind. Its propeller spun, a blur born from a 2,100 horsepower engine that snarled like a living thing. The pilot's gloved hand gripped the throttle. Every vibration of the fuselage felt coiled, impatient. To his right, rows of older Hellcats sat silent, powerful but suddenly ancient. Because this new aircraft was something else entirely, smaller, sharper, hungrier, the Grumman F8F Bearcat. It was the fastest climbing piston fighter the U.S. Navy had ever built, and though its wings were ready, war's clock was running out. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japan was crumbling. The skies that had once demanded constant blood and courage were now almost empty. The Bearcat was built for battles that never came, but its story would prove that even a war's ending could give birth to a new beginning. The question now, why did America build the Bearcat when victory was already in sight? By early 1944, the Pacific had become an ocean of wreckage and smoke. Japan's empire, once sweeping and unstoppable, was bleeding from every direction. The Mariana Islands had fallen. The Philippines loomed next, and over the Pacific, the blue sky was increasingly ruled by the U.S. Navy's carrier fighters, especially one, the Grumman F8F Hellcat. It had been America's workhorse, the guardian of the fleet, the ultimate balance between firepower, range, and ruggedness. With over 5,000 kills claimed, the Hellcat crushed Japan's dwindling air fleet. But the engineers at Grumman weren't satisfied. They knew enough of air combat to sense that speed was evolutionary, not final. Somewhere, engineers in Japan or Germany might already be conceiving something faster, smaller, deadlier. At the war's front line, Hellcat pilots were flying escorts over Leyte and Formosa, leaning into their controls at 20,000 feet, grateful for the machine's toughness. But many returned at dusk talking about new kinds of dogfights, fleeting, violent encounters with agile Japanese interceptors like the Kawanishi N1K2J Shidenkai and the prototype A7M Reppu. Pilots knew these aircraft weren't numerous, yet they hinted at a dangerous truth: the enemy's final evolution could still sting. Back in Bethpage, Long Island, where Grumman's factory hangars pulsed with the noise of drills, hammers, and engines, talk shifted from production numbers to theoretical performance. Engineers ran their fingers along the aluminum frames of mock-ups, muttering about weight, drag, angle of attack. The U.S. Navy wanted something that could reach top altitude in mere seconds, take off from a carrier half the size of the Essex class, and intercept enemy bombers before they could even close on a fleet. It would need to climb faster than a Hellcat, turn tighter, and still hit like a sledgehammer. That challenge birthed the Bearcat. Grumman's chief engineer, William Schwendler, and test pilot Bob Hall began sketching a new kind of energy fighter. Not a brawler like the Hellcat, but a pure sprinter. The design goal was audacious: improve. The F-6F's climb by 50%, while cutting its weight drastically. Every ounce mattered. They sought inspiration from an unlikely source: captured German and British designs. Late in 1943, Grumman engineers examined a Focke-Wulf FW-190A, a compact, beautifully aggressive fighter with remarkable acceleration. They admired how its design put maximum power into the smallest possible airframe. That philosophy seeped quietly into the Bearcat's blueprint. By early 1944, mock-ups stood ready. The Bearcat's frame was shorter, its wings clipped to reduce drag. Its fuselage tightened like a coiled spring around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the same raw-throated 18-cylinder engine that powered the Corsair and Hellcat, but now propelling an aircraft roughly 2,000 pounds, lighter. The result promised an extreme kind of performance: a fighter that could leap from sea level to 20,000 feet in under 5 minutes. For carrier operations, that was revolutionary. A ship could scramble interceptors in seconds rather than minutes. Seconds. That could mean the difference between survival and a burning deck. But there was tension in the timing. The Navy already had air superiority across the Pacific. Victory wasn't just visible, it was inevitable. Many officers wondered, why waste resources developing another Piston fighter when jets were emerging? At bases from Patuxent River to San Diego, test pilots were already watching early American jets like the Bell P-59 era Comet stumble into existence. The age of the propeller was drawing to a close, yet the Navy argued for pragmatism. Carriers needed aircraft that could operate reliably from decks, something early jets couldn't promise. The Bearcat was insurance, a cutting-edge Piston, fighter that could dominate the Pacific skies if the war dragged on into 1946. In the months that followed, engineers refined details obsessively, trimming metal, shaving weight, studying airflow in wind tunnels lit by bare bulbs at midnight. Test flights in 1944 confirmed the Bearcat's incredible energy retention. Pilots described it in simple terms: it leaps. As Japan's resistance hardened at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, plans expanded. The Bearcat would join frontline squadrons for the final push, Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. But time was running faster than construction lines. The Bearcat's sleek prototype had yet to land on a carrier deck. The war was about to end, and no one knew whether this new aircraft would ever face an enemy. It was the paradox of war's twilight. Invention racing against a clock already striking peace. The men designing it had no idea that the Bearcat would arrive just as the shooting stopped, yet its engine was about to roar to life anyway. The roar needed a runway, and that was the one thing the Navy still had plenty of. On the factory floor, at Bethpage, the smell of fuel and fresh paint hung over the newborn fighters. Each F8F rolled forward like a bullet that had waited too long to be fired. Grumman's engineers had created something that looked deceptively simple, yet everything in it was purposeful, stripped to combat necessity. The Bearcat's frame was built around a single idea: power without excess. The airframe was the smallest possible wrapper around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2834W, an engine that could produce 2,100 horsepower with emergency water injection. By comparison, a Hellcat with the same engine felt like a weightlifter. This was a sprinter. Every inch of the Bearcat was refined for speed and climb. Its fuselage was 20% smaller than the Hellcat's, its vertical tail enlarged for better control, its landing gear lightened and shortened, so the pilot sat higher, improving visibility on carrier approach. Designers cut the canopy down to a low, clear bubble, granting a near 360-degree view, something naval pilots had long envied in British Spitfires. But the innovations didn't stop with weight reduction. The Bearcat's wings folded automatically, upward, saving deck space aboard carriers. Its wingtips could also be released in case of a rough arrestor hook landing. Unlike many overbuilt American fighters, it carried only 450 caliber Browning machine guns, enough to destroy anything aloft, yet lighter than the Hellcat's 6. Fewer guns meant less ammunition weight. Less weight meant faster climb. The first prototype rolled out in August 1944, Grumman Model G58A. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics representatives were skeptical but curious. They watched as Bob Hall taxied down the runway, the aircraft's stubby nose rising slightly. The double Wasp engine howled, and the Bearcat lifted off in just a few hundred feet. Hall banked upward, rolling and diving with a grace that stunned even veteran observers. The speed came like a punch, nearly 450 miles per hour, in level flight, almost matching the Navy's fastest Corsairs. Feedback was unambiguous. It was a fighter pilot's dream. But there was a shadow behind the praise. Test flights in Maryland and California collided with logistical delays. Production slots were already committed to Hellcats and Corsairs supporting island operations. The Bearcat, brilliant but late, struggled to find priority space in America's vast war machine. By the time Grumman secured full production orders, Japan was already losing half its shipping and most of its skilled aviators. Cities burned nightly under B-29 attacks. In laboratories across Japan, teams tried to restore balance by designing miracle interceptors like the J-7W Shinden, radical pusher prop fighters meant to confront high-altitude bombers. But time and fuel shortages made prototypes useless curiosities. The Air War's scale had outpaced experimentation. Still, the Navy hedged its bets. Orders were placed for over 2,000 Bearcats. Assembly lines accelerated, parts flown across the continent under escort. Training squadrons formed on both coasts, VF-18A and VF-19A, newly equipped with the aircraft that nobody yet knew they would never take into combat. In July 1945, the first F-8Fs reached Squadron VF-19A at Nas Alameda, California. Pilots were awestruck at how the Bearcat left the ground like a kicked arrow. One later recalled, "The throttle wasn't something you advanced, it was something you unleashed." The Navy was already assigning Bearcat units for the post-Okinawa expansion, anticipating the invasion of Kyushu planned for that fall. Codenamed Operation Olympic, planners expected thousands of kamikaze sorties. Against that threat, the Bearcat's thunderous climb and acceleration promised to be decisive. But on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, everything changed. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Atomic fire replaced the need for steel and piston engines. The Empire surrendered days later. Hundreds of Bearcats sat ready in crates, others on test fields. The war had ended before they could prove themselves in battle. Yet even in peacetime, the Bearcat refused to fade quietly. The U.S. Navy kept it as the ultimate piston engine fighter through the late 1940s, training the first generation of jet pilots on its unforgiving agility. The engineers who built it had set out to create the apex of the propeller-driven era. They did it. The world simply moved on before it could matter. In that strange intersection of triumph and timing, the Bearcat stood as both epitaph and torchbearer, a machine that closed one chapter of aviation while pointing directly to the jet age. And it's through the people who flew, tested, and maintained it, humans chasing perfection in their final piston-driven dance, that we understand what those months meant. The Bearcat story might begin with blueprints and horsepower figures, but what truly defined it were the people who touched it, the pilots who strapped in, the mechanics who murmured to its temperamental engine, and the engineers who refused to compromise weight for comfort. Each had their own angle in the quiet revolution the F-8F represented. The human angle. The pilots who almost fought the last fight for the fighter pilots graduating in mid-1945. The Bearcat wasn't just metal, it was supposed to be salvation. Men who had flown F-6Fs across the Central Pacific suddenly found themselves assigned to something that felt alien in its responsiveness. Transitioning pilots remember the moment they eased the throttle forward at run-up, and the world simply lurched ahead. There was no long acceleration, no ponderous roll. The Bearcat jumped. Lieutenant Jocko Clark, one of the first to test fly the type for the Navy's Pacific Fleet Air Arm, described it in typically sparse naval understatement. "It goes where you think, not where you tell it." That kind of sensitivity, while thrilling, demanded restraint. The Bearcat punished lazy feet and rewarded precision. Instructors at NAS Pensacola commented that new pilots had to relearn how much elevator to pull, because the aircraft could easily overshoot in tight turns. It was, one said, like teaching a boxer who suddenly grew twice as strong overnight. Even without combat, the aircraft offered moments of revelation. On convoy patrols and training climbs off San Diego, pilots tested its vertical ability. From takeoff to 10,000 feet in less than 2 minutes. They raced Hellcats and Corsairs for pride, though no one pretended the outcome was in doubt. The Bearcat always vanished skyward first. When word of the bombings reached these squadrons, celebration mixed with an odd hollowness. Many had trained expecting to fly cover over Japan itself. Instead, they faced disbandment before ever firing a shot. Their Bearcats became symbols of a fight that never arrived, proof of readiness that history denied. Yet every pilot who touched one remembered its feel. Light, electric, listening to the pilot in a way few machines ever did. The technological angle, a masterclass in minimalism behind the glamour of speed, lay an uncompromising engineering philosophy. Grumman's team understood that innovation in 1944 wasn't about adding, but subtracting. They asked, how little can we build while still delivering everything the Navy needs? Every component was reconsidered. The F-8F's engine mount used magnesium alloy brackets trimmed almost to transparency. Armored glass replaced whole steel plates. Fuel lines, normally routed for convenience, were rerouted for balance to save trimming ballast. Even the tailhook assembly, that humble carrier fighter lifeline, weighed half that of its Hellcat predecessor. The effect was transformative. Fully loaded, the Bearcat weighed roughly 8,000 pounds, a staggering 2,400 pounds lighter than the Corsair. That difference didn't just translate to speed, it meant control authority. The slightest control input affected the aircraft instantly. It pivoted around its propeller axis like a dancer around a partner's hand. Then there was its climb rate. At 4,800 feet per minute, the Bearcat reached altitudes that made radar operators blink. For decades afterward, test pilot reports used it as a benchmark for piston plane vertical performance. But it wasn't just numbers. The Bearcat's beauty lay in the way the design looked unified. From its humped spine to the wide four-blade propeller, the aircraft seemed almost organic. Aerodynamicists later compared its drag profile favorably against jets entering service only 3 years later. That efficiency wasn't accidental. It was born from what Grumman engineers learned dissecting the German FW-190. They saw how the Luftwaffe fighter achieved stability through compact strength, and then improved on it using American material science and machining tolerance. You could trace the lineage of transatlantic competition in the curve of a Bearcat's rudder. The result was a paradox, a machine designed for killing that worked like fine sculpture. Standing on the tarmac beside one, pilots often called it cute. They didn't mean it kindly. They meant it looked too small to hold what it did. But when the prop started, cute vanished, replaced by the deep, physical heartbeat of the R-2800 engine reverberating in the chest. The logistic angle, the irony of abundance, the Bearcat entered a Navy simultaneously riding its greatest industrial high and preparing for massive peacetime contraction. Logistics officers faced bizarre dilemmas. More aircraft coming off lines than any war could possibly absorb. Hellcats still filled supply warehouses. Corsairs continued to roll off Voughts assembly lines, and jet prototypes now begged for resources. In Washington, procurement officers debated the Bearcat's fate between piles of paperwork labeled Victory Surplus. Naval Aviation News even ran a small photograph captioned almost wistfully, "The fleet's next clause." The problem was, by the time they arrived, the prey was gone. Factories kept turning them out because stopping production was politically harder than finishing allotted orders. By VJ Day, 24 production Bearcats had been delivered. Within months, that number surged into the hundreds, aircraft assembled for carriers that might never launch them. Still, the Navy found purpose. They repurposed the F8F for interceptor readiness training. On slow peacetime patrols, it became the dream of young aviators testing stick discipline. Mechanics adored its simplicity. After years of cursing cramped engine bays, the Bearcat's removable nose panels felt like a gift. Each new aircraft still left the assembly floor polished and perfect. War or no war, Grumman believed in building as if the next dogfight could start tomorrow. Those who flew it in that suspended moment between battle and peace discovered the Bearcat was more than a tool. It was a statement that excellence didn't need an enemy to justify itself. That same spirit lingered in how other nations, designers, and rival engineers saw it, and in what they learned from it. The enemy's angle, Japan's final air warriors by 1945. Japan's air defense was built on courage more than capability. Most of its veteran pilots had been lost since the Solomons and Marianas campaigns. Those who remained flew aircraft that were nimble, but outmatched by American engines and radar coordination. Yet inside Japan's aircraft bureaus, designers never surrendered creativity. Captured documents after the war revealed sketches of what the Imperial Navy hoped would counter the new generation of American fighters. Among them, the A-7M Repu, meant to succeed the legendary Zero, and the remarkable J-7W Shinden, a canard-style interceptor built to climb fast enough to meet bombers at altitude before escort fighters arrived. On paper, those aircraft might have equaled or even surpassed the Bearcat, if there had been fuel, materials, and training left to field them. But by the time the Bearcat first roared down an American runway, Japanese pilots were flying patched-up Ki-84s with makeshift fuel blends, their cockpits lined with exposed insulation and missing radios. To those few who glimpsed test photos or fragments of reports on the Bearcat's projected capabilities after the war, the reaction was disbelief. A fighter that could outclimb any Japanese type by minutes felt less like another opponent and more like an omen, the reminder of how far industrial disparity had grown. when post-surrender technical teams from Japan toured American naval air stations in late 1945. They encountered the Bearcat themselves. At Nias Alameda, Allied interpreters recorded their astonishment. One Japanese officer reportedly said, "We thought the Hellcat was America's last cat." In a sense, he wasn't wrong. The feline namesake met its final evolution in silence just after the hunting was done. The Bearcat never faced Zeros or Tonys or Franks, but it represented a truth every surviving Axis engineer recognized immediately. America's innovation curve hadn't slowed at victory. It was accelerating. The strategic and moral angle, the blade forged too late in every war. A moment comes when design overtakes necessity. The Bearcat was that moment for America's carrier aviation. It epitomized a Navy that always looked 6 months ahead, even when peace appeared certain. Its existence posed a quiet moral question threaded through every era of technological warfare. What do you do with perfection built for destruction, when destruction is no longer required? In September 1945, with Japan's surrender signed aboard the USS Missouri, hundreds of Bearcats stood newly painted, their Navy roundels bright against aluminum skin. They would never meet an enemy in anger. Pilots trained in acrobatics instead of interception. Tactics manuals drafted for invasion were archived unread. And yet the timing of its birth made the Bearcat valuable in a profound human sense. It became the bridge between the brutal urgency of wartime innovation and the reflective technical curiosity of peace. The same design rules that shaped its wings, minimal drag, maximum thrust, would inform how American aerodynamics transitioned into the jet age. The aircraft was both closure and prologue. On one hand, it symbolized everything piston engines could achieve. On the other, it whispered that human ingenuity doesn't rest, even when the fighting stops. When naval historian Eugene Gill later described the era, he said, "The Bearcat was a violin built for a concert that was canceled. But the instrument still played, just in another hall, under new lights." The legacy angle, the Bearcat's second life piece, redefined the Bearcat's purpose. It became the ultimate classroom desk for the jet age's first pupils. Instructors at NAS Corpus Christi, NAS Jacksonville, and NAS Pensacola used it to teach combat maneuvers to pilots destined to fly straight-wing jets like the F8 Phantom and F9F Panther. What they learned in the Bearcat's cockpit translated directly. Energy conservation, throttle sensitivity, high-speed stall awareness. Veterans later said flying the Bearcat made early jets feel less alive but more predictable. Meanwhile, in 1946, the Bearcat found unexpected fame in the U.S. Navy's newly formed Blue Angels demonstration team. Its compact silhouette painted in deep blue streaked through American skies, performing tight formation loops that no other prop plane could match. To spectators, it was equal parts machine and choreography, a celebration of precision without bloodshed. Internationally, the Bearcat's reputation spread. The French Navy adopted it in its fight over Indochina, and Thai squadrons flew it through the 1950s. In these roles, the Bearcat finally met combat, brief, brutal, and far removed from the Pacific stage it had been born for. Reports from French pilots in 1951 praised its robustness and speed, echoing American assessments 6 years earlier. The war it missed still found it half a world away. Even from there, it influenced generations. Civilian aviators later modified Bearcats for unlimited air racing, pushing speeds past 500 miles per hour. One engine modification, christened Rare Bear, set climb and speed records that stood for decades. A ghost of the Navy's last piston ace, roaring long after carrier decks went quiet. Through all these transformations, the Bearcat carried a single truth at its core. Innovation rarely stops exactly where history expects it to. It had begun as the Navy's planned counter to kamikaze waves that never came. It ended as a living demonstration of mechanical artistry, the bridge between the storm and the silence. And that silence would soon be broken by a new sound entirely. The thin whistle of jet turbines spinning up on bow catapults, ready to propel America's next generation of fighters. The Bearcat's wings had barely cooled before those first jets fired their engines on deck. That image, propeller wash fading into jet blast, marks the moment war's savagery transformed into technological momentum. Which brings us to the Bearcat's turning point, when piston perfection met the coming jet revolution head-on. Late spring, 1945, the Pacific horizon bristled with steel and illusion. From the decks of carriers bound toward Japanese waters, the air buzzed with the discipline of seasoned war machinery. At Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland, the Navy's Flight Test Division was quietly putting the finishing touches on what its pilots believed could end the kamikaze threat for good. A single-engine fighter that could leap from the sea like an arrow. The Bearcat's arrival came just as the Navy turned its strategic gaze toward the Japanese mainland. Operation Downfall was penciled onto maps in secret rooms. 2 massive landings, Olympic on Kyushu, Coronet on Honshu, projected to begin in late 1945 and early 1946. The expected resistance was beyond imagination. Estimates warned of thousands of suicide aircraft, maybe tens of thousands waiting in camouflaged dispersal fields. The Navy's planners needed a shipborne interceptor that could vault into the sky within seconds of an alarm. The Bearcat seemed written for that role. At NAS Atlantic City, pilots timed its takeoff run from a rolling deck simulation. 291 feet from brake release to liftoff, unheard of for a high-power Navy fighter. The fastest Hellcat required nearly twice that. The climb rate tests confirmed it, 4,800 feet per minute. In the Pacific, that kind of response could make the difference between losing a carrier and surviving the first minute of an air raid. Word spread among carrier air groups preparing for downfall. By June 1945, squadrons VF-18A and VF-19A had started conversion training at Alameda in Norfolk, their barracks walls decorated with chalk sketches of the new aircraft's stubby silhouette. The men complained, half joking, that the Bearcat's landing gear looked child-sized. Then they flew it and the laughter stopped. Pilots returned shaking their heads and grinning. It was electric. Every test note brimmed with possibility. Full throttle, 2,700 RPM, 3,000 feet, faster than the F4U-1D and no torque roll. Handles like a dream. Another pilot recorded simply, "This one wants to go vertical." Carrier qualifications followed aboard the USS Langley, CVL-27. In June's humid Atlantic air, test pilot Lieutenant Commander Fred M. Trapnell brought the Bearcat over the deck for its first approach. The landing signal officer watched with folded arms. The airplane looked absurdly small against the carrier's length. But as it touched down, the Bearcat sank cleanly onto the wires and rolled to a stop without bounce. Trapnell's grin told the rest, approved. By July, Grumman and the Navy were turning out aircraft on an accelerated schedule. Field representatives traveled up the Hudson and down to the Gulf to help transition squadrons. Paint crews brushed fresh sea blue coats over newly riveted skins. Manuals printed on thick, green paper were rushed to carriers headed west. The atmosphere was one of expectation, final preparations for a new kind of storm. Everyone understood what was waiting if the invasion went ahead. Intelligence estimates projected 1.9 million Japanese troops defending Kyushu. Kamikaze instructions were printed for high school boys and even for women's volunteer corps. For naval aviators, the Bearcat seemed purpose-built for that apocalyptic scenario. Short deck launch, savage climb, and the agility to turn inside a diving attacker before the enemy reached a carrier stack. But history pivoted faster than any engine could spin. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. Reports filtered inconsistently back to the training stations. Initial disbelief, then shock, then a strange sort of silence. Some officers argued that the Bearcat's deployment would be unaffected. Surely there would still be need for occupation patrols. Yet when the second bomb erupted over Nagasaki 3 days later, all the scheduled transfer orders evaporated. The U.S. Navy continued flying its Bearcats. But the missions changed overnight, from combat training to post-war trials. Tokyo Bay's surrender ceremony on September 2nd determined more than peace. It defined the Bearcat's destiny. It would no longer be a weapon of war, but a symbol of what could have been. A technological boundary line, drawn at the summit of Piston evolution. Even so, within months after VJ Day, the aircraft found itself in another race. A competition not against enemies, but against time and turbines. Jet propulsion had matured in the shadows. America's McDonnell F-H-1 Phantom and Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star were already streaking, down runways at speeds no propeller could match. The Bearcats' unmatched climb and acceleration suddenly served a new purpose. a yardstick for what jet aircraft needed to outperform. Engineers and test crews compared every figure, every altitude record, every stall speed. The Bearcat wasn't just the last cat, it was the final exam before the future began. As 1946 dawned, its silhouette became rarer on flight lines, but more revered. The men who flew it during those months often said it felt like holding a torch at the end of a marathon, knowing the finish line was moments behind, yet unwilling to let go of the heat. Its greatest test was still to come. From steady carrier launches to airshow dives, from evaluation flights to record runs, the Bearcat had more to prove, not to an enemy, but to its own creators who refused to let its brilliance fall quietly into retirement. And that defiance of obsolescence, of time itself, became its true turning point. The war had ended, but for the Bearcat the proving ground had only shifted, from battlefields to the echoing calm of peacetime runways. What had been conceived as a weapon now became a benchmark, a challenge to every aircraft that would follow. In the crisp winter air of 1946, test fields at Patuxent River and Edwards Air Force Base hummed with transition. Engineers rolled out what they called bracket tests. Piston fighters on one side, the F8F P-51H and late series Corsair. Emerging jets on the other, the FH-1 Phantom and FJ-1 Fury. Pilots climbed from one cockpit to the next, notebooks thick with comparative data. The verdict was paradoxical. Below 20,000 feet, the Bearcat still held its own. In acceleration and raw climb, it beat the early jets off the line every time. The Phantom and Shooting Star could outpace it given altitude and time, but no jet of that generation could match how instantly the F8F responded to throttle and stick. Instructors half-joked that the Bearcat was the last plane where the man had more authority than the math. You flew it by instinct, not procedure. A Navy pilot at Patuxent recorded one flight note that read simply, "At full power, the nose points wherever your heart does." It wasn't metaphor, it was legacy. For months, the Bearcat reigned as the definitive training machine. Naval squadrons at NAS Jacksonville and Corpus Christi used it to toughen young pilots before moving them into jets. You graduated from Hellcats into Bearcats if you were good, and from Bearcats into Phantoms if you were better. That short lineage made it both teacher and gatekeeper, the last piston-powered judge of an evolving age. And it wasn't confined to classrooms. In 1946, the U.S. Navy formed the Flight Demonstration Squadron, later known as the Blue Angels. The Bearcat was their chosen frame. Painted deep sea blue trimmed with gold, it carried naval aviation from the anger of the Pacific into the optimism of American airfields. Crowds from Providence to Los Angeles watched Bearcats carve arcs across summer skies. Children covered their ears as those four-bladed propellers screamed through formation loops. Where war once demanded speed, peace now demanded grace. For Grumman engineers, those air shows were vindication. The same strength that had built skyrockets and Hellcats had not gone wasted. As they watched the Blue Angels Bearcats fly in perfect diamond, engineers who once hunched over draft tables recognized what they'd really built. Not just a fighter, but the distilled spirit of American aviation in transition. Yet even as the cheers rose, the sound of another revolution was rising behind the hangars, the whistle of jet turbines spooling up. By 1947, the Bearcat's silhouette began disappearing from frontline carriers. Jets like the McDonnell F-H Phantom, Grumman F9F Panther, and later F-2H Banshee offered speed curves the Bearcat could no longer chase. Still, the aircraft refused to vanish quietly. It entered a new theater, the arena of peacetime innovation. Test pilots used it to push materials, fluids, and propeller designs beyond known limits. Engineers experimented with wingtip configurations, exhaust augmenters, and lighter prop hubs, each test wringing the last secrets from piston flight. Then came the races. In 1949, surplus Bearcats began appearing in the hands of civilians, aviators unwilling to leave wartime performance behind. They stripped the Navy paint, polished the aluminum, and modified engines for sheer speed. At Cleveland and Reno, these reborn Bearcats streaked past crowds as living fossils of engineering perfection. Decades later, Rare Bear, a heavily modified F8F, would set world records for time to climb and piston aircraft speed, ascending 5,000 meters in just over 90 seconds, and bursting past 528 miles per hour. The record stood stubbornly like the aircraft itself. Meanwhile, Foreign services began putting the Bearcat into the combat it had missed in 1945. The French Navy, desperate for capable fighters in its Indochina conflict, deployed them from carriers Arromanches and Bois-Belot. Over jungle terrain and river deltas, French pilots discovered what American crews had only theorized: the Bearcat was lethal. It bore the heat, humidity, and punishment of tropical warfare, with the same ease it had handled North Atlantic winds. Thai pilots flew it too, using it for air defense through the 1950s. And in those wars of decolonization, a machine built for one cataclysm participated in the lingering embers of another. But home in America, the sound of piston thunder faded. The earliest swept-wing jets had arrived. The Navy's decks now shimmered with Furies, Panthers, Banshees, and eventually Cougars, names as fierce, but powered by fire, not air. By 1952, the Bearcat's service as a frontline trainer ended. A few remained for reserve squadrons. Others were retired to airfields, stripped of insignia, sold to private owners, or preserved for museums. Its life had come full circle, born to finish one war, finding its meaning in the very peace that followed, that final irony that an aircraft designed for destruction became a symbol of skill and control, is what makes the Bearcat story timeless, because when the turbine's hiss replaced the propeller's roar, the Bearcat didn't vanish. It simply stepped aside, leaving behind the unmistakable echo of its climb, a sound that said, "This is as far as pistons can go." The world that followed would move faster, fly higher, burn hotter. But every jet that left a carrier deck owed something, some curve, some lesson, to that last defiant warrior of aluminum and oil, and from that moment of industrial twilight rose a new dawn of flight, jets screaming into the heavens where, once the Bearcat's propeller had carved the D, ere when the Bearcat's final combat role dissolved, into training and demonstration, the Navy still called it a victory. The aircraft had achieved what few designs ever could. It had reached the mechanical limit of its lineage. To the men of Grumman, that meant success, not obsolescence. In numbers, it was modest compared to the great armadas of the Hellcat and Corsair. 265 F8Fs were built between 1945 and 1949, a fraction of what planners had once projected for an extended Pacific War. But every airframe represented the end of a long journey in piston technology. Of those, few were lost to accident. The Bearcat's forgiving reputation held true. Pilots who flew it trusted its instincts even under mechanical strain. Maintenance crews learned to strip and rebuild an F8F faster than almost any other fighter, thanks to its uncluttered design. The same direct access that made it a mechanic's favorite also meant it remained a flight school workhorse well into the early 1950s. Operationally, its Navy service was brief but symbolic. It equipped roughly a dozen squadrons between 1946 and 1949, among them VF-3A, VF-17A, and VF-19A. They performed patrols, carrier evaluations, and functioned as the precision instruments of a fleet shifting toward jets. The Bearcat's short takeoff distance and tremendous roll rate made it a natural bridge to the high-performance aircraft of the coming decade. Pilots transferring to the early McDonnell F-2H Banshee and Grumman F-9F Panther used Bearcat sorties as ritual preparation. You learned how to think fast in the F-8F. You learned how to fly on rails in the jet. Industrial transitions mirrored that change. The Bethpage plant that once produced Bearcats began tooling for jet prototypes by 1947. Grumman engineers, veterans of rivet smoke and slide rules, now chased higher ceilings in sleek blue steel forms. The knowledge curve bent sharply upward. Control harmonics measured for the Bearcat directly informed catapult tolerances and stress tests for the F-9F, the first true jet designed for carrier life. In the same years, the U.S. Navy reoriented its philosophy. Peacetime budgets tightened. Aircraft procurement shifted from quantity to signal advantage. Fewer models, faster rotation. Training squadrons parked older F-8Fs along hangar edges waiting for surplus disposal orders. Rows of clean blue machines that had never seen combat were ferried away to storage fields in Arizona and California. Their engines drained of oil, wings folded like sleeping birds. The press hardly noticed their quiet retirement. Headlines celebrated new speeds, new medals, new records. The piston engine, once the king of aviation, was becoming the machinery of nostalgia. Yet not all Bearcats faded without a trace. A handful transferred to foreign service, their U.S. insignia replaced by roundels of allied nations still rebuilding their fledgling air arms. France received 95. Thailand took 50. For countries just beginning to rebuild, the Bearcat was a promise, a machine that still embodied first-rate American engineering without requiring jet infrastructure. And within the United States, the Blue Angels continued flying them until 1949. The Bearcat became an ambassador of grace instead of aggression, looping and rolling through parades of post-war optimism. Children born during the war saw it as a vision of peace converted from battle, a warrior turned performer. Meanwhile, deeper in Navy testing grounds, a new category of data began appearing in engineering logs. Transition ratios, propeller effect analogs, those figures described how propeller-driven momentum could smooth carrier approaches, numbers that guided flight control, software development decades later. The Bearcat was still teaching lessons long after its last mission ended. It hadn't just served the Navy, it had quietly written the closing chapter of an era and the introduction of another. Some historians rank it as the most refined propeller fighter ever built. It was a title the Bearcat carried without fanfare, because it never had to prove it in battle. But among pilots and engineers, that untested perfection became legend. A rare blend of timing and mastery that almost outran its own century. In the years that followed, the Bearcat's shape and legacy would ripple beyond the Navy's records, reappearing unexpectedly in global conflicts in the world of competitive speed. Those echoes formed the aircraft's true afterlife, the song of power that refused to quiet down even when peace demanded. Silence. When official Navy service ended, the Bearcat did what all good machines eventually must. It found new hands. Its story scattered across continents, slipping out of military order and into the messy, impulsive energy of a world rediscovering its skies. Foreign wings, Indochina and the tropics, the French aeronaval accepted its first F8Fs in 1951, landing them aboard the carriers Arromanches, Bois-Belot, and Lafayette. Overnight, grizzled mechanics who had worked on Seafires and ancient Wildcats were learning an American engine's temperament. In the steamy heat of Indochina, Squadrons 11.F and 12.F launched Bearcats on ground attack and escort missions. The pilots called it Le Chat Féroce, the fierce cat. They dove from 9,000 feet into clouds thick with jungle humidity, releasing light bombs and 50 caliber bursts at targets in the Red River Delta. The Bearcat's climb performance, engineered for kamikazes, became perfect for pulling out of narrow valleys laced with flak. French records list over 4,000 operational sorties before the type began to thin out in 1953. At the same time, across Southeast Asia, Thailand kept its own batch in pristine order. The Royal Thai Air Force used them for air defense and training until the mid-1950s. Thai crews prized the machine's reliability, minimal maintenance, quick startup, and the kind of acceleration that turned regional patrols into small air shows. In both cases, the Bearcat's legacy was paradoxical. It was fighting wars Roosevelt and Truman had hoped to prevent, small hot embers sparked from the ashes of a global fire. The aircraft that America never used in combat was now policing the very world peace it helped secure. Sport, speed, and survival back home, surplus F8Fs began slipping into civilian registries. Aviation enthusiasts bought them at government auctions for prices that would have embarrassed the engineers who designed them. Between $200 and $1,800 each, less than the cost of one modern family car. But those buyers weren't after practicality. They wanted performance pure and unfiltered. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Bearcat became the crown jewel of unlimited air racing. Its broad prop and short wings made it a perfect foundation for modification. Highly tuned derivatives with names like Conquest and Rare Bear roared through pylons at Reno air races. Propellers flashing silver in desert sunlight. Rare Bear, rebuilt around the original Bearcat structure, shattered climb and speed records. To 10,000 feet in under 2 minutes, top speeds beyond 528 maps, setting a standard for piston flight that would outlive its designers. The aircraft that began as a Navy interceptor became a national performance icon. The Piston Age's last defiant roar in a century increasingly ruled by turbine. Sound preservation, museums and memories today, fewer than 50 Bearcats survive. A handful remain airworthy. Others occupy quiet corners of museums in Pensacola, Washington, and Paris. Their glossy midnight blue paint sits under hangar lights like still water, their propeller tips frozen mid-twist. Pilots who climb the steps to look down those long noses almost always say the same thing. It looks fast even standing still. In educational displays, the Bearcat often sits beside a Corsair or an F8F Panther, physical shorthand for aviation's hinge moment, where one war ended and another kind of race began. Visitors trace their fingers along fuselage rivets, soaking in the paradox of engineering brilliance built for a battle that never came. Curators call the Bearcat the punctuation mark at the end of a furious sentence. Legacy in the jet era, its direct descendants flew with turbines, the F9F Panther, the F11F Tiger, even the mighty F-14 Tomcat carried echoes of that 1944 design philosophy: compact strength, pilot visibility, instant throttle response. Each of those jets bore Grumman's logo, and every engineer working on them could quote the Bearcat's climb numbers by heart. In this way, the aircraft's DNA survived transformation. Its simplicity informed generations of mechanics. Its responsiveness trained generations of pilots. It was the evolutionary bridge between two worlds, where air still obeyed propeller physics, and another, where thrust came from fire and faith. The Bearcat lived only a short moment as an active weapon, yet its influence extended across decades of naval aviation design. A quiet legacy, perhaps, but one that endures every time a modern carrier pilot eases into the controls of a fighter and feels that same instinctive connection. The sense that the aircraft knows what you're thinking. The Bearcat's time had ended, but its lesson had not. The machine that closed one war now whispered of the next frontier, and that whisper forms the calm before our final reflection. What the Bearcat's journey truly meant to history, to technology, and to the human pursuit of perfection. In the long rhythm of history, a few machines become more than the sum of their metal. They capture the instant humanity stands on one threshold and peers into another. The F8F Bearcat was one of them. It never fought the battles it was built for, yet it fought a larger one, against the limits of physics, against the drag of complacency. Conceived in a rush of wartime fear, it matured in the hush that follows victory. The Bearcat proved that pursuit of excellence need not end when the guns fall silent. It proved that refinement itself can be a kind of courage. Every line on its fuselage was an argument for grace. Every climb test a demonstration of what engineers could achieve when the only opponent left was the clock. In its brief life, the Bearcat represented the perfection of the propeller age, a moment when human intuition still guided the airflow, when flight was felt through fingertips and seat of the pants instead of computer code. To look at one today is to see a time capsule of human momentum at the brink of the jet age. You hear the deep radial pulse fade into the thin whistle of turbines and realize both sounds belong to the same story: the relentless human need to go faster, higher, and better. The Bearcat reminds us that progress is never wasted, even when it arrives too late for war. Every breakthrough, every rivet of understanding, becomes a stepping stone for the next leap. So as hangar lights glint across that dark blue paint, reflect on what it represents: the last echo of Piston thunder and the first whisper of a future defined by jet fire. If the story of the Bearcat moved you, share this film with someone who still listens for that radial roar. Subscribe for more cinematic deep dives into the machines and people who shaped modern warfare and flight. Explore our archive to trace how each evolution in engineering rewrote the sky we fly in today. Because history doesn't just live in museums. It breathes through engines, innovation, and the will to keep climbing. The Bearcat's climb ended decades ago. Humanity's hasn't.